Okay, it's fantastic. So my name's Dr. Alexander Lees. Then I'm a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, sort of currently living on the edge of the Peak District. This is actually, this cover image here is a picture of mine from Sale Water Park, which is just in South Manchester, and an important local site for Willettit, which more of which later. So I think this is the third BOC talk that I've done in recent years. I've spoken at two joint BOC and NBC, Neotropical Bird Club meetings. I think the one I talked at in 2016, I was talking about shortfalls in neotropical ornithology, and within that, I touched on how species interactions then can govern which species occur in which environments along a gradient of sort of environmental degradation, if you like, on Brazil then. And the paper for that is available now, this sort of roadmap to filling shortfalls. So if anyone wants a copy of that, feel free to pop me an email. And then a couple of years ago, I spoke to you guys about how species interactions, again, can even shape what avian plumage actually looks like. So the avian phenotype, the avian appearance can be shaped via species interactions through mimicry. So that was, again, a subject of an entire talk. So you're sort of seeing here a sort of repeated theme then about an interest I have in species interactions. And I'm also quite interested, obviously spend a lot of time in the neotropics and doing work in Amazonia, and I've even worked in urban assemblages in Amazonia. I think we published the first paper describing sort of Amazonian urban bird communities, and essentially urban areas are totally novel ecosystems, and they have these sort of idiosyncratic avifaunas, if you like, which there's no historical precedent. Now, we also know that bird communities within urban areas are structured by what we call sort of habitat filtering. So the way in which, you know, the habitat availability structures which species can and can't occur. But that sort of habitat filtering, if you like, is also mediated by interactions between species. And we know this by comparisons between cities and across regions where, you know, one or more, well, we know you have two co-occurring species which might compete with each other, such as in this example, house and tree sparrow. So, you know, we often think about how habitat mediates what species occur, but interactions between species are also incredibly important. And again, you can find this in pristine habitats. I could give a whole talk on just how co-occurring Amazonian bird species, even in undisturbed landscapes, can replace each other along gradients, environmental gradients, such as between dark water, well, between like Varzea, for instance, flooded and unflooded forests, for instance. So you're thinking, so what, you know, why is Alex talking about bird feeding, and where's this paper come from, right? Well, the ontogeny, if you like, of this paper stems from Jack Shutt recently joining my sort of lab at Manchester, and he was successful in applying for a postdoc, working with me and looking at how basically Amazonian bird species ranges are changing with global change. So that's what Jack's doing, like, most of the time. But Jack came to me, and previously he'd been a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and he was studying basically the responses of birds and what birds were eating along a latitudinal gradient in Scotland. And one of his papers basically used a technique called fecal metabarcoding. So from bird feces, birds which he caught, he was able to sort of extract data from their poo to work out what these birds have been eating. And the amazing thing, what Jack found, is that all of his blue tits, basically across anywhere he was along this gradient from urban to rural in Scotland, which is itself a not particularly densely populated part of this country, contained bird food. And so looking at this plot here, you're seeing like a decay function with increasing distance then from human habitation here. But, you know, any blue tits caught anywhere near human habitation, like up to 100% of their feces he recorded included bird food. But even some, you know, 1,400 meters away from the nearest house still contained lots of bird food. So we sort of ruminated on this question and the implications that his results had really for potential for these ecological cascading impacts from bird feeding. And we basically wrote a paper which wasn't just looking at birds, it was looking at all the different types of provisioning we give for wildlife, and how these sort of positive and negative impacts sort of add up stemming from our provisioning of wildlife. Now, we basically created like a conceptual map, if you like, for the different sorts of interactions that we can have when provisioning wildlife. Now, that sort of conceptual map sort of divides itself up along two different axes. So one category is whether or not our provisioning is targeted. Is it directed at like a single species, or is it generalized? Are we just putting food out there and it's sort of anything that shows up is a target, if you like? Whereas and then whether or not the food or food or whatever resource it is we provide wildlife, it makes up for something which has been lost in the ecosystem. Are we replacing a resource which has been lost because we've changed that system, or are we producing more resources on top of plentiful natural resources? And you can basically think about any interaction we have with wildlife where we provide some sort of resource, and you can divide them up across these four different possible boxes, basically. So to give you some examples of this, so as a targeted provision for lost resources, then an example might be providing nest boxes for threatened species like the Santa Marta parakeet, for instance. Now, there's lots and lots of examples where we have provided resources to threatened species as a conservation intervention, which has been incredibly important in ensuring the survival of species. So this is from a paper that Rika Bolam at Newcastle led on, that I was involved with, basically looking at which bird and also which mammal species, which aren't shown in this plot, basically have been saved from extinction by human intervention. So at the top here, we've got a list. We've got a number of species which are, only exist in captivity these days, so they've obviously been saved. And then a list of a number of other species where we have high confidence that interventions by people have prevented extinctions. This was based on an expert elicitation survey, which I was one of the experts, where people were scoring these interventions. And if we look at some of these species which have been helped, many of them have been helped by supplementary feeding. For instance, California condors, we continuously provide food for those. Various species of parrots, pink pigeon here, again, supplementary feeding goes on for that. Things like barley miners and echo parakeets as well. Lots and lots of species, essentially a major conservation intervention has been providing either food or nest boxes or water or what have you. So but this is targeted, right? We're thinking, what does species X need? And our conservation intervention is maneuver Y, providing whatever thing this species needs. But there are also kind of generalized provisioning for lost resources. And I should backtrack there a second as well. The idea being a lost resource, because those parakeets, for instance, live in areas where there's been lots of logging of large trees. So these birds have lost their natural nest sites. And by putting up nest boxes, we are providing a replacement for those lost resources. So we also have generalized provisioning for lost resources. And an example of this, for instance, might be in the UK, where we provide supplementary food for, and also sort of wild bird cover crops for a whole suite of increasingly rare farmland bird species. An example here of corn bunting, but equally this could be linnets or yellowhammers or various other species. And we have the agri-environment schemes, and we have directed provisioning for these species. And the food in this case, it makes up for the loss, for instance, of winter stubbles. We've seen a huge switch in the UK towards winter wheat. And that switch, which happened like sort of in the 80s and 90s, is sort of happened concurrently with big declines in many of these species, because we'd removed a key resource from them. And by providing food for these species, well, we may well be helping them and maybe buffering them from local extinction. Another example might be provisioning of carcasses for vultures. Again, another group of species doing very, very badly. Obviously, when you provide carcasses to vultures, they're available for all sorts of other species as well, often multiple species of vultures and or other raptors and or mammals, etc. But sort of vulture restaurants, if you like, have been a key conservation intervention to ensure the survival of these species. In places like the States, for condors, for instance, the idea has been to stop them eating some sort of wild food stuffs, because they're often contaminated with lead, for instance, from hunting. So it's almost been a way of trying to stop them eating some natural food resources, or even eating washed up whales like they do normally might be a bad thing for condors, because whales are so chock full of environmental toxins these days, and that ends up getting biomagnified up the food chain and into condors, etc. I include this map here, which is actually sort of foraging for two species of vultures, griffon vulture on the left and black vulture on the right, just because it also illustrates this amazing difference in what you might call sort of sanitary regimes between Portugal and Spain, right? In Portugal, the carcasses of farm animals have to be disposed of, whereas in Spain they don't. So there's plenty of carrion in Spain and virtually none in Portugal. And it's like movements of these vultures, as you can see from this map. They show basically individual sorts of satellite locations and telemetry. It shows that these birds virtually never cross the national frontier, because there's no food in Portugal for them. And then we can think of provisioning also in terms of additional resources, right? So an example here might be targeted feeding of ant pitters at lodges in South America, for instance, or indeed various different species of birds to sort of benefit ecotourism. I've been cage diving with great white sharks, for instance. Now, it's not like those sharks don't have enough food to eat. We give them food because we want them near us, in the same way we give these ant pitters food and they want them near us. Again, there have been some sort of eyebrows raised about provisioning, this sort of directed provisioning of food. It's probably a reasonably good intervention to ensure sort of a minimal birdly disturbance to some of these species. And I noticed when I was prepping this talk, there was an interesting sort of speculative little paper by Harold Greene talking about, well, maybe how come ant pitters are so willing to come and hang out with us and take worms? Well, it could even be a legacy of some past sort of ecological fixation of ant pitters on megafauna, and ant pitters may well follow people, and much in the same way sort of robins in temperate latitudes follow people because of this interaction with wild mammals. And there've also been plenty of observations of ant pitters, following wild pigs and peccaries and such like as well. So maybe it's quite easy to build this sort of relationship with these species, because it's almost a sort of replacement for lost historical relationships. And then we have our final category, which is generalized provisioning of additional resources. So we are putting food out sort of en masse, and it's food which is additional. It's, these species have resources within the natural world, but we're providing extra resources. So one example of that, which is quite frequently found in literature, is a waterhole provisioning in Africa, for instance. So in an effort to attract wild game, either for sort of eco-tourists to see or for hunters to hunt, people often dig basically sort of water bodies, ponds and little lakes in dry land areas, because that will increase the amount of game and increase the species diversity in these areas. Now, that also has a potentially sort of deleterious negative impact, because that you take away the sort of the niche of some of the more mesic species, the dry adapted species, because then some of the more dominant species from wetter areas can then compete in those environments and potentially replace the mesic associated species. And then obviously what you've all been tuning in for, another example of this generalized provisioning is essentially the feeding of birds, which millions of people do worldwide in our gardens. This is an image of a Eurasian siskin on a bird feeder, which was up in my garden a couple of years ago. And I've fed birds personally. I've fed black-throated mangoes and banana quits when I lived in the Brazilian Amazon in Belém. I fed pileated woodpeckers and juncos and white-throated sparrows when I lived in Ithaca and Cornell. And in my garden here in the edge of the Peak District, I've had, the regular stuff, plus I guess why many birders feed birds is to attract the more unusual things. So I've had, bramblings and reed buntings and these sort of things visiting my garden. Now, Globally, then the bird food market is valued at $5 to $6 billion, and it's growing 4% annually. And it surprises me really how sort of little we've interrogated, this huge industry and the changes it may be precipitating on birds, which is kind of what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of today's talk then. But bear in mind, bird feeding is just one facet of our interactions with the natural world where we provision resources, but to a greater or lesser extent, it's one of the biggest and most important. And it's why within the context of this paper, we had a whole section devoted to a case study just about bird feeding, and specifically just about bird feeding in the UK, because the UK is quite different from many places, right? We have quite high population density here. We've got relatively little intact habitat in this country, and we are super obsessed by wild nature, which is ironic then, given that we're actually one of the poorest performing countries in the world for biodiversity, despite the fact that we have sort of the highest per capita membership of conservation NGOs, and we sort of lap up Attenborough documentaries, etc. So it's sad that both we underperform for biodiversity, but everyone wants to do their bit, it seems, and their bit for many people has been to go to the shops and buy some stuff to put out for birds, basically. So this provisioning then falls into this generalized provisioning and additional resources category. So in the UK then, over 17 million households, that's 64% of us spend a total of £250 million or more than 150,000 tons of bird food annually. Now they sound like big numbers, because they are very big numbers. That's enough food to feed 3 times the entire breeding population of the 10 commonest feeder using species year round if they consume nothing else. Now, obviously, lots of bird food goes to waste. It's thrown away or whatever. So it's not like all that food gets eaten. A lot of it gets eaten by other things that aren't birds too. I'll go on to talk about those sort of impacts. But it's big business, and it's a huge resource boom for these species concerned, right? So we have like an average of 100 bird feeders per square kilometre in this country. And that's basically one feeder for sort of per 9 bird feeder using birds. And then we couldn't find accurate estimates of the number of nest boxes. There was a figure of 4.7 million nest boxes in private gardens a decade ago, and it seems likely that number would have gone up rather than gone down. There's also estimated to be at least like 1 million bird baths out there. But basically enough bird boxes for every pair of blue and great tits in the entire country. Not that all blue and great tits use bird boxes. I've put several bird boxes up my garden and nothing's ever used them, for instance. But obviously, lots of bird boxes do get used. And the scope of this, then, some of you might notice the Google search term at the bottom there. So the other night, I just did a quick search, and you type bird feeding into Google, you get 2.16 billion hits. It's bird feeding is a really big thing globally, right? And then there have been several studies looking at sort of the impacts of bird feeding, usually looking at sort of the positive impacts, if you like. And we know that sort of the range of bird feeding products offered there is increasing, seemingly exponentially so in this plot. So this is from a paper led by Kate Plummer and a team mostly from the BTO, published in 2019. And they essentially looked at sort of the impact of bird feeding on some of these commoner species, the way that bird feeding has changed and the way it's grown, etc. So that's also a really useful reference for us in this paper then. And so there are various sort of positive impacts of bird feeding on those birds which are being fed, right? So provisioned food can make up to 75% of an individual feeder using bird's daily diet. That's not to say that all birds are getting 75% of their food from bird tables, but some are. For some individuals of species get 3/4 of their nutritional requirement from food we put out for birds. We know that for many species, bird feeding leads to increased survival rates, particularly in winter. So, birds that might otherwise die in winter are surviving. We know that birds which are fed can have increased productivity and reproductive success. So birds which are fed produce more birds. We know that birds which are fed can often have individual sort of higher quality health and reduce parasite loads. Again, parasite loads are highly tied to individual fitness. So you're healthier, you have fewer parasites, for instance. We know that bird feeding can increase the density of those birds which are fed, and that leads to, you know, higher populations and higher abundance of those species. And we know it can even lead to sort of changes to where birds are found, right? The classic example, which I don't dwell on here, is the story about blackcaps, right? Blackcaps now from Germany have been wintering in the UK since what it is the 1960s and 70s, and now thousands of them, and really almost potentially even driving speciation in blackcaps, right? Because those German blackcaps which fly to winter in the middle of Manchester, they get back to Germany before the blackcaps from Germany which have gone to Spain or Morocco. And they're pairing up with other blackcaps from the UK. So there've been genetic studies gone on this, and this could be a path to the creation of an entire new species of blackcap, just because we're feeding birds in gardens, and because cities are warmer than the countryside as well. It's not just the food which is available to blackcaps, it's also the conditions, right? So cities are this new ecosystem, warmer temperatures because of urban heat island effects. And so the impacts of bird feeding could extend all the way to you know, creating new species of birds even. So that's the example of blackcaps. There's also examples in the States with species like red-bellied woodpecker. I think it's probably a good example of this, which are pushing northwards because, you know, they're sort of held by what the winter temperature is like, and they're available to ability to access food. So bird tables mean that food is available for these species, and they can winter further north, for instance. Another example, generalized provisioning, lesser black-backed gulls, a nice example as well, sort of think off the top of my head as well. You know, most lesser black-backed gulls used to winter in Africa, and now lots spend the winter in the UK because we've got, you know, agriculture and rubbish dumps. So they're increasingly closing provide food in winter for lesser black-backed gulls. So again, a generalized accidental provisioning, if you like, there, which is changing bird distributions. So this is also from the Plummer paper. Species in red on this graph on the left are species which have increased their sort of visitation from feeders into feeders, and the blue ones which have decreased. So lots and lots of species are visiting feeders more, and those species which are visiting feeders more are also usually increasing their population as well. I mean, sort of big increases here with wood pigeon and goldfinch. I mean, goldfinch is a spectacular sort of success story in terms of garden bird feeding, and also possibly a legacy effect of reduced persecution, right? Goldfinch used to a species which was really targeted for the songbird trade, even in this country, even as late as 1960s, and even to this day, it's absolutely threatened in North Africa because of trade for songbirds. I mean, it's really rare in places like Tunisia and Algeria, for instance. Whereas there are a few blue arrows here. House sparrows and starlings are declining, song thrush declining, and then missel thrush here and marsh tit also declining. But largely a story of bird species which are regular feeders increasing. And in fact, if we look down here, you know, the species which occur in urban areas and use feeders tend to be going up, and those which occur in urban areas and don't use feeders are either sort of stable or going down, basically. So there's an overall story there in this paper that bird feeding is benefiting some of these species and leading to increases in their populations, right? And we think about, well, why do we feed birds, right? And I guess we think we're helping birds, but in many ways we're sort of helping ourselves, right? And feeding birds is one of the most important connection with nature things we can do, if you like. You know, millions of people get a real buzz out of providing food for birds and sort of caring for birds, if you like, and providing these resources and bringing birds close to them, and that improves our mental well-being, basically. Really drawn into quite sharp sort of perspective during the COVID pandemic. You know, lots of people that never fed birds before reported, you know, feeling really happy feeding the birds because they were deprived access to the wilderness, and feeding birds brings nature close to you, etc. And we hope, obviously, that bird feeding may be a gateway activity into going birding or joining the RSPB or the BTO or Cornell Lab of Ornithology or whatever it is, right? And then contributing to biodiversity in different ways as well, right? So there's this potential positive feedbacks between feeding birds and feeling good about yourself, and then possibly even going out and doing more for nature beyond just feeding birds. However, there are also lots of negative impacts arising from bird feeding. So first off, just thinking about some direct impacts on birds, right? So we're seeing sort of increased both intra, so within species, and between species, rates of disease transfer, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. We see increased predation risk, both by natural predators and by domestic pets, right? By bringing birds into our gardens, they run a higher risk of being eaten by cats, for instance. And birds like sparrowhawks, for instance, can easily become habituated to feeders. We know from radio tagging experiments that have been done that like sparrowhawks at places they're fed just literally hang out by the feeder all day. That's not a great problem to eat lots of common species at feeders, but it is a problem if they're, very successfully targeting rarer species, for instance. We know we get lots of impacts from window collisions and road collisions by bringing birds close to us. And there are also sort of emerging evidence then of, sort of potential dependency amongst some species, poor nutrition, depending on what's being offered, and even impacts on sperm and blood chemistry, which I'll talk about in a second, right? The biggie really that most people are aware of these direct impacts is disease, right? And we know in this country that trichomoniasis, which is a disease basically caused by this the protozoan parasite, Trichomonas galleni, it basically jumped species in 2005. Formerly in this country, it's mostly found in galliforms like pheasants and in pigeons. It jumped into songbirds in 2005, around the same time that wood pigeons were coming into gardens in a big way. And it very quickly precipitated a colossal, catastrophic decline in greenfinches. This is 2005 here, and we lost like 70% nearly of our greenfinches in this country. Millions and millions of greenfinches died. And it's quite incredible, really, how, in many ways, we didn't really bat that much of an eyelid about that. We sort of lost all these birds, and people said, right, take your feeders down, if you've got birds visiting. But, ultimately, they just continued to decline because they continued to get trichomonas, this infection, causes these lesions you can hear on this dissected bird here. And we've now got a similar problem in chaffinches, which are also, populations which are really tanking, and also various other emerging infectious diseases, things like Paraday pox affects tits, big outbreaks in the continent of that. There was a mystery disease, which people haven't even worked out what it was in the US over the summer. People were told to pull bird feeders down there. And I think from the latest information I heard from Cornell was that a lot of them, people have been told to put feeders back now. They're not quite sure about this. But either way, we know that bird feeders are a real sort of vector for disease. When you think about it, you've got a persistent aggregation of birds, which occurs year round, clustered around a single plastic object, right? Multi-species pecking at this plastic object. In the wild, there's no year-round food source, clustered that feeds multiple species with exactly the same space in space and time. So this is, it's a perfect storm really for sort of zero social distancing between multiple species year round, etc. And even if this sort of moves you to do nothing, it should certainly move you to clean feeders a lot more often. Because I think a lot of people are guilty with only occasionally cleaning bird feeders, at least by the state of them I see. And so there are also even indications that the very food itself might have deleterious impact. So there's a study showing that like greenfinches suffered like sperm abnormalities from excessive consumption of like omega-6 fatty acids, which they're getting from just eating sunflower seeds. And you think, well, why are they just doing that? Well, it's like if you're given like an item of food which is really easy to get, you just continue eating that and ignore other food sources, right? Again, it shouldn't come as a particular surprise. And then there's another story looking at a paper looking at changes in blood chemistry in the Australian magpie. Basically, they were getting sort of cholesterol problems from eating all these sort of handouts. So again, bad diet impacts. But there's very few papers on this, and it's been very understudied. So we don't really understand what the sort of long-term impacts of changing birds' diet is. And I sort of wondered myself when, you've got sort of flocks of long-tailed tits mostly eating like rendered beef lard or whatever, and thinking, well, is that good for long-tailed tits? They certainly seem to like it, but whether you like something and it being good for you are two different things, right? I really like drinking beer, but it's probably not something that's necessarily good for me, nor that should be drinking that every day, for instance. And then what we really focus on this paper are these sort of negative indirect effects of bird feeding. This is kind of the novelty of where we were going, because most of these other things have been said before in other papers. But what was new about our paper and what's attracted a lot of attention, this idea of indirect effects. And this is what really hasn't been studied by anyone. And what we say we really need to get a good handle on, because we don't currently know. So we would expect increased competition for natural resources, and potential for reduced competitor populations. You know, in ecology, in natural systems, if we increase populations of one species, it's quite possible that will have a concomitant impact on populations of other species. Now, one of those mechanisms is just by direct competition for food or for other resources, right? And I'll go on to talk more about this in a minute. Another way is like hyperpredation on natural prey of recipient taxa. So imagine if we have, you know, more blue and great tits, well, they may deplete natural prey resources used by competitors, for instance. The things we provide food to may even directly eat other species, right? I mean, often corvids do very well in and around people's gardens, and they will be accessing bird food, and that then leads higher populations of those species, which can then have an impact on nest predation of other species, which may or may not be provisioned themselves, right? But if, you know, if we're getting more of these sort of mesopredator species, then, you know, that can have concurrent ecosystem impacts, basically. So what can this lead to? Then this can potentially lead to basically a takeover by dominant and or non-native species. So when I say dominant, then, and this harks right back to what we talked about at the beginning, with this idea of some species in nature are competitively dominant and some species are subordinate. Now, the dominant species can often have like a wider ecological niche than the subordinates, and the subordinates then often become specialists, or they have to develop special behaviors, ways in which they can coexist with these dominant species. And something I'm not talked about today, but something which is also bears considering, is that, you know, we think nowadays the greatest challenge for humanity revolves around the question of what is land for? You know, what are we going to land are we going to spare for nature? What land are we going to use to produce our food? And what land is producing ecosystem services which are critical to humanity's survival, right? So for instance, is growing Niger seed in West Africa to ship back and feed siskins in my garden, is that a good use of land? Or is that land better left to West African endemic species? So that's a question we ask ourselves about what we do where, what we grow where, what is the cost associated with producing this food and transporting this food? I mean, would we be better rewilding the area in the UK we used to grow some bird foodstuffs, for instance, or should we just be feeding that bird food to declining farmland birds like yellowhammers rather than providing it to abundant British species like blue and great tits, for instance? So these are some of the sort of bigger questions we need to get into. But what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk now is this idea of community takeover by these dominant species. And this is our contention in the paper, which is these indirect impacts of bird feeding may be more pervasive, and I mean pervasive in a negative fashion, than is currently appreciated. So what we're seeing in Europe is this rise of the generalists, right? Humanity is reshaping the biosphere, and in reshaping it, we often create conditions which favor a relatively small number of species. And they don't tend to favor the specialists, they favor the generalists. You know, we're creating lots of great habitat and great conditions for carrion crows. You know, we're not creating great habitats and conditions for nutcrackers or for, you know, bearded tits necessarily, though that's obviously a great example of a successful conservation intervention because we've spent millions on creating wetlands. But lots of species which are declining because they have this, you know, small realized niche. You know, the habitats they can use are reduced, and they're often subordinate species. So there's an overall backdrop of the rise of the generalists, basically. Now, harking all the way back then to a paper here, like 4 years before I was born, then in American Naturalist. Niche breadth as a function of social dominance, right? The idea here being that species with like a broader niche that do more things are often more socially dominant. And then basically the presence of dominance is a factor making conditions uncertain for subordinates, right? Two pieces of information that we've had for a very, very long time. You know, dominants have wider niches, dominants impact subordinate species. So we see this rise of the generalists quite clearly in the UK. You know, in the UK, we've like added an extra 800,000 great tits in the last like 20 years. A lot of that increase has taken place because we've fed great tits. We're putting out vast amounts of food for them. We're putting out vast amounts of other resources like nest boxes. And at the same time, we've seen species like marsh tits and willow tits declining and declining and declining. Another example, great and lesser spotted woodpecker. Great spotted woodpecker is one of the sort of species which are most benefited from bird feeding. Lesser spotted woodpecker, another species which is really, really doing badly in this country. And then the sort of the poster child of species doing badly in this country, the fastest declining British bird is willet-tit, which, at the rate that willet-tit is disappearing, it could be extinct, within my lifetime in the UK, which would be a global extinction of the Kleinschmidti endemic taxon of willet-tit, right? It's like a 94% decline in willet-tit in 2 or 3 decades. It's already basically absent from southern England, south of the line between the Severn and the Wash. This BTO data is old here. There's one individual left, I think, in Norfolk at the moment, or if there's not one, there's like 2 or something. I mean, it's a bird which is doing catastrophically badly, right? And many of you are thinking, well, why has that happened? And it's easy to reach for the obvious explanation, which is habitat, right? But the thing is, we study these birds really well. We know British birds better than we do like any other bird populations anywhere on Earth. I can tell you now, it's not habitat. There's now more habitat available for marsh tit, more habitat for willet-tit than there was 30 years ago, more habitat for lesser spotted woodpecker. We've done the science on this. So one guy, Richard Broughton here, has really led on a lot of these works on declining woodland birds. So if anyone on Twitter, he's at woodland birder on there, so it's just giving him a follow, right? So this is from his paper then, little evidence for a relationship between changes in bird distribution and habitat cover, except even for marsh tit, where it seems that there is some vague link in some of those regions. But, basically we can't reach for our sort of standard explanation for why things are declining in the case of these common woodland species. And this is a trend we're seeing in many woodland birds in the UK, right? I mean, I missed actually reading the article, but someone mentioned to me, I think it was an article in Birdwatch magazine written by some guy there who was talking about how, 40 years or 50 years ago in Epping Forest, there were marsh tits and willet-tits and red starts and lesser-spotted woodpeckers and all these cool woodland birds, and they're all gone now. All the birds you can see in Epping Forest, you can see in his garden as well. We've lost all our core woodland birds, despite the fact that our woodland extent in this country is now increasing, admittedly from real historical lows. And people have done the science on willet-tits. We know why they're declining, right? So the chief reason why willet-tit breeding attempts fail is because willet-tits are evicted by blue-tits. Now, this might not sound like a terrible thing, but those willet-tits have dug their own nest. They're like little woodpeckers. They excavate their own nest cavity. That's not something that you do overnight. That takes a lot of time and a lot of willet-tit effort to do. Yet they're they're excavating these cavities, and then they're getting taken over by blue-tit, which is the competitively dominant species. So this was accounting for 1/3 of losses during the laying and incubation stage, and 40% of all 58% of nest failures in a monitored population of willet-tits. Like the second biggest loss for willet-tits was like 62% were due to predation, right? And like 50% of that predation events were from great spotted woodpeckers. So another species which is increased because of generalized provisioning is then free to hyperpredate on these populations of these rare woodland species. Great spotted woodpeckers are also one of the key reasons why lesser spotted woodpeckers are declining, because they'll also either predate their nests or steal their nests as well. So this competition between subordinates and dominants is a very important way that communities are structured, but we are changing the nature of this game by providing food to dominants, basically. And so this is from Jack's earlier paper, and we basically here shows that, again, species which are using feeders a lot are going up, species which are outcompeted by blue-tits are going down, and species suffering these sort of nest competition impacts are also going down. So this is across multiple taxa, and there's a clear signal for competition being a major driver of declines in UK species. So the important thing to remember here then is the behaviors that these subordinates have. We talked about earlier on the way in which subordinate species have certain life history strategies to cope with the bullying dominance, right? So for an example, willet-tits, we mentioned earlier on, dig their own nest chambers, right? But the only British, I think possibly only European tit to do that, somebody might correct me. But that gives them a competitive advantage. Willet-tits, the reason why they're doing well in like brownfield sites in the UK and these early successional woodlands is because they're not competing with blue and great tits, because those species can't occupy those sites until there are big enough tree cavities or nest boxes to use them. So they escape from competition. And so these areas are becoming like the last redoubt for willow tits because they have lower competition. So obviously, if you've bought this up and you turn it to a nature reserve and then you stick bird feeders up and bird boxes up where you let the blue and great tits in, which can be potentially curtains for willow tits at these sites. Willow tits and marsh tits cache food, right? They bury food in winter for a cold winter or a rainy day, whatever it is. Cold tits do that as well. And many of you who've got a bird feed will notice the cold tit, like all the day, even though there's a bird feed available 24/7, burying food all winter, right? That's a survival strategy these things have. Blue and great tits don't do that. Cold winter, that could cause massive mortality of blue and great tits, which could be fantastic for marsh and willow tits because that's their competitors. Bird feeding insulates blue and great tits against these die-off, basically. Provisioning nest boxes tips basically competition in the favor of blue and great tits over willow tits. Marsh tits as well, we know from experiments with feeders by moving them around woodlands that marsh tits are fastest at finding resources. So you move a feeder to some random place in the wood, marsh tits find it before anything else does. That gives marsh tits an advantage in a natural system where food is ephemeral. Food isn't available 24/7 at one place in space and time in a natural system, but this isn't a natural system, right? This is our anthropogenic system. So again, having this trait of finding food quicker is not important when you've got a bird feeder and food available year round, right? Migration is another strategy. Think about our pied flycatchers or wood warblers or whatever it is. You know, they're migrating to Africa, they come back and they're competing with blue and great tits, another dominant species for food. They're hedging their bets that every now and then there's a cold winter that's knocked out a load of blue and great tits, they come back to an emptier wood. They no longer have that competition for food and for nest boxes, right? Nest boxes or natural cavities. Any one of you who studied pied flycatchers will know that, you know, they're displaced by blue and great tits and sometimes even killed by them. Yeah, it happens quite regularly that there'll be a fight in a nest box and a great tit will kill an adult pied flycatcher and then put a nest over the top of it. Great tits are amazing sort of little predators, even recorded eating bats in caves, and there's an amazing video on YouTube of them killing redpolls. So we might think of them as being this sort of obviously I don't want to be accused of hating great tits or anything, but just to recognize that they are a little predator and quite an important competitor, basically. And then I mentioned earlier on this idea of nest boxes, right? There's also perhaps a role for, you know, by provisioning nest boxes, perhaps as well, we tip the balance out of favor of open cup nesters, which again are competing with the cavity nesting species. Maybe we alter that balance of competition. Maybe in areas without cavities, things like wood warblers, which nest on the ground, do better because they lose their competitors. So there's all sorts of ecological interactions here, and providing food 24/7 in vast quantities will interfere with these natural interactions, basically. So I've mentioned most of these stories here. Another one I haven't mentioned is ringneck parakeets, which the sort of emerging evidence of competitive impacts there, and it's very unlikely that ringneck parakeets would persist at all if it wasn't for bird feeding. Basically, it's what keeps them going. But basically, things going up like great tits, blue tits, great speckled beggars, nuthatches, things going down are all these subordinate species which lose out in battles with the dominants. I'm not saying that wood warbler here is competing with ringneck parakeet. It's just another example of a subordinate species which is doing badly. And then this conceptual map just shows these sort of different interactions we can get in these systems, you know, and how, you know, magpies obtaining food from feeders means they can, you know, potentially predate on top of willow tits. Even more great tits might mean more sparrowhawks. That means more predation of willow tits, for instance, or you know, various different interactions with pets or invasives or everything else here. And then there are other impacts we don't really have a great handle on. I asked a journalist spoke to me about the other day about this, and I pulled off a completely off-the-cuff example of an ecosystem service which might be compromised by feeding in some way. Just because I've got a cherry tree in my garden, in fact, it's just literally just outside my office here, and it was absolutely infested with aphids in the spring, and to the extent we only had like 3 cherries on this cherry tree. You think, where am I going with this? Well, I was watching the damn blue tits flying over my tree, all spring to go and eat on the neighbour's feeders. And I'm like, there's loads of food for you in this tree. Can't you perform this ecosystem service and eat these aphids? But it never happened because they've got free for all food. And this is a quantitative example right here. So a study from South Africa, which has shown that in areas adjacent to urban areas where there's high rates of provisioning, like sunbirds don't do pollination because, well, why would you when you've got, nectar for free at a bird feeder 24/7? Why are you going to spend all that time flying around trap lining flowers? So the flowers in these areas don't get pollinated as much because we've stolen the birds away from their natural behaviors and stopped them performing these ecosystem services. There's similar examples from the neotropics on hummingbirds as well, where visitation rates of flowers are lower around feeders. Again, this is very context dependent, right? The UK is kind of the odd one out here because of our landscape context where there's lots and lots of people, lots and lots of bird feeders. In most places, like I wouldn't say to a lodge, don't put feeders out because it's a tight couple of feeders across an huge area of rainforest, right? The impact is a fine trade-off. People can see birds at feeders, no big deal. The issue comes when bird feeding is incredibly dominant because in this country, you're never far from a feeder. So all of these target dominant species have access essentially to bird food in the UK. Now, this paper seems to be quite well received online. At least I've not had like a huge amount of pushback. Some people have sort of waved their hands around and said, well, what about all the other things they do as well? A couple of people have mentioned, what about pheasants? We release 45 million pheasants into this country, and what if impact is that provisioning happening, and shouldn't we sort that out? And I'd say yes. I wrote the paper on this 10 years ago now, and it's certainly something we want to understand the impact of, because you can't put 45 million game birds into this country without complex impacts on predators, on prey, on carrion provision, on everything else, right? But to me, the bird feeding example is no different from the pheasant example. It's something we don't have a good handle on, and we really need to understand sort of what's going on. And globally, there's also differences, right? If you went to Australia and New Zealand, well, people are totally against bird feeding there. Everyone says, don't feed the birds because it causes all these negative impacts. In some of the places, people are ambivalent about it, whereas in North America and in Europe, we're very, very, very sort of pro bird feeding, basically. But there's heterogeneity in what environmental NGOs tell us to do in different parts of the country. The reason why in Australia, people don't want you feeding the birds is because you get more of these noisy miners. Now, again, Australia always seems to be a place of hyperbole, right? A noisy miner is like great tit times a million, right? They can literally like kill or exclude all birds in their territory. They can collapse the entire avian web of life by constantly harrowing all the other honey eaters to the extent they basically will vacate the territories of these honey eaters. So a paper title here, Avifaunal Disarray Due to a Single Despotic Species, an extract from the paper, native species affected by human activities can become agents that induce ecological dysfunction. Now, the UK isn't Australia. Noisy miners are not great tits, but great tits are somewhere between noisy miners and less sort of ecologically impactful species. Again, I've shown you several of these diagrams. I'm not going to dwell on this one here, but essentially by changing the landscape, we favor noisy miners. They like anthropogenic habitats and they benefit from provisioning, and they even benefit from some plants which are nectar providing that people provision in these habitats as well. So even there, people don't suggest like planting lots of really rich sort of nectar rich shrubs or whatever, because they can become monopolized by these noisy miners. So sort of hot take on this, there's a capacity for this generalized provisioning to erode biodiversity by altering interactions between species and potentially contributing towards homogenization, right? What we do need to know is how these interactions work and mitigate them. It isn't don't feed birds at all. It's quite possible that without bird feeding, like house sparrow could disappear from British cities. In British cities, what is left for house sparrows, right? It's likely that it is the only resource, bird feed. I mean, that's why the populations have collapsed, because there's no longer any of these natural food resources. Bird feeding could be the only thing keeping them going. Whereas in suburbia and especially in areas next to rural areas, bird feeding might just be providing resources for lots of common birds, which can suppress populations of rarer species, right? So what I can't tell you at this point is what we do and where. That's the more science bit. And I know everyone's always, oh, scientists, they always say more science needed. But the idea behind this paper and this talk is that we need to understand this. It's very cavalier of us to have got to this point and not to have thought about these interactions. And we need an evidence-based background for what we do moving forward. I ended up actually on the BBC breakfast sofa trying to give this message in like 3 minutes, which was obviously a disaster because you can't explain something which is this complicated in 3 minutes. So apologies to anyone that saw that and got that take home there. And I did want to acknowledge David Fisher, who again a long friend within the NBC, and really sad that he passed on tragically, and someone that along with Robert had invited me to give these talks previously, and I'm sure that he would have found a lot to take home from this one. So RIP David as well. And so open field to any questions. This is my wife feeding a Canada jay in upstate New York, which would be a targeted provision of additional resources, and probably not a major agent of ecological dysfunction, but who knows. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope we've got time for a few questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine.
I was having problems earlier, I'm afraid, and I very much apologize for not introducing you.
No problem. But
that was a really tremendous talk, and in fact, even more wide-ranging than I had thought it might be. Having looked at some of the questions coming up during the talk, you seem somehow to have answered many of them en route. And in particular, this point that no doubt most people will be asking, what attitude should I, in an ordinary suburban house, now be taking to bird feeding?
So the key for me, well, in terms of whether we stop or not, I guess it depends where you are and what you're feeding. And if our currency is house sparrows, then, can we feed things that aren't feeding blue and great tits? Then maybe that's part of the choice here. But ultimately, especially if you own your own garden, then just making gardens better habitat for all wildlife, right? I mean, I've sort of going around gardens, and obviously not that anyone here would have one of these gardens, but there's a garden which is entirely plastic and plastic grass and plastic bushes and a bird feeder. And for that person there, they obviously don't want the trials and tribulations of having an actual garden. And for them, they've done their bit for wildlife by providing a bird feeder. And my argument would be, well, let's have wilder gardens. Let's not just provide resources for 10 species of common birds. You can get thousands of species in gardens of all the invertebrates and all the building blocks for an entire ecosystem, right? That provide resources not just for blue and great tits, but for everything else. So, and I granted that not everyone owns a garden, and quite often people that don't own a garden live in the cities where bird feeding probably has its least ill effects, right? Where there are no specialists left, all you've got is generalists, and probably being propped up by bird feeding. So my best example is do what you can, and then bird feeding as a resort. And certainly, if you've got house sparrows in the city centre, don't change what you're doing. But if you're in a rural area, then let's try and be much more targeted, and let's provide resources, and just bear in mind that what we don't want is another 800,000 great tits, because there's a clear pathway by which these generalists can be impacting on stuff. But there's a lot of science to do to come up with something prescriptive that says, you live in SW7, you do this, and this postcode, you do that. Although I will let you onto this idea that myself and Richard Broughton and Jack are writing another piece quite targeted to think about willow tits on reserves, for instance. I think the strongest evidence is there that it's the common bird species going up are impacting willow tits, because that work has been done, and we know that it's like if it was a mammal, we'd end up going out and killing it, right? We don't want to kill blue and great tits, but we probably don't want to make more of them. So there's an obvious targeted intervention, which is helping the generalists, and the specialists can sort themselves out basically by doing all the special things they do.
So given the problems in putting over complex messages to the general public, how exactly do you see the way forward now in trying to get the subtleties of the case across?
Well, I think that the science needs to be done, so it needs PhDs and postdocs to look at where currently birds are, look at the change over the past, model that with what we think are approximations for the feeding density, think about maybe targeted, think about feeding foodstuff A versus B, and working out what are we really doing, right? I mean, is birding in this country really helping anything beyond house sparrow and starling in these areas as well? I mean, you think about what we're losing, most of those species aren't coming to bird feeders full stop. So I think we need to stand back and think, well, what does bird feeding do? And then if we need to sort of replace that with another interaction, that's possible. I just don't have all the answers to this right now. I know it feels like I'm going around in circles, but I'm sort of very loath for everyone to completely change their behavior on imperfect information. But certainly if you live anywhere near marsh and willow tits, my suggestion would be don't put feeders out for blue and great tits. If you really want birds in your garden, feed Niger seed to goldfinches or redpolls or siskins. But obviously it'd be good to understand where that Niger seed came from and the consequences of growing that in West Africa, for instance. So there's a lot of variables here to try and think about.
There certainly are, and I particularly like the way you tied in things like mass pheasant release as well into the argument, which is clearly having an extraordinary effect on British ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, we're so far from any sort of natural baseline, and it's almost, that was, I mean, the pheasant releases itself is a response to collapse of farmland biodiversity, right? So grey partridge, the game bird that all these people used to shoot, went extinct because farmland become unsuitable for wild nature, right? So the answer to that was putting food into these systems, and in many ways bird feeding is kind of a bit like that. We've seen declining bird populations, so we've tried to replace that and up the numbers of birds, but we've only helped the species which were kind of doing all right in the first instance, basically.
One of your key audiences is going to be the RSPB. What is their current reaction to?
I've had very little reaction to the RSPB yet, though Jack will be giving a seminar there. I know it's been circulated internally, so they're certainly aware of it. And I'd hope that sort of RSPB and BTO would be inclined to, if not to lead on this, but to be involved with doing the science, because they have the big data sets you can use to start answering some of these questions. So I'd hope they'd be keen. So the BTO account, for instance, retweeted a tweet of mine a while back on this, so they're certainly aware of it. And again, a lot of the science that predates ours that raises some of these questions, but maybe doesn't sort of says, well, maybe there's issues. I think a lot of people have thought about this, and hopefully this sort of papers a sort of wake up call that we really need to understand what's going on. But I think the change has come really with Richard's papers on willow tits that have shown the direct link to the generalists. That's sort of the smoking gun for the impacts. But other people have raised some of these issues already.
Are there other questions that people wish to raise? Anybody going to come up with anything on chat to?
Yeah, somebody mentioned swoop or whatever else. I mean, I wrote a sort of an op-ed for the Guardian on this a while back. And if you think about the change, right? I mean, people used to sort of put just a bit of food out in cold weather, right? Putting a bit of bread out for the birds in the 60s, and it has evolved into this huge industry. So it mentioned swoop, whatever it is, and all these products and such like. So it is a huge, I can't sort of under-emphasize how much change this has been in a relatively short period of time in the way that resources have become available for birds, whilst at the same time, our natural systems here, in many of them we've homogenized many areas, less woodland, certainly far more farmland landscapes, for instance. And then a lot of urban areas also become poorer for wildlife as well. We've paved over, gardens and removed brownfield sites, and many of these areas have become all the poorer.
Are you setting up any sort of central resource covering this area, which people can go to in order to appreciate the actual scope of what you're talking about and the diversity of information that is becoming available?
Well, I'd hope the paper answers that to an extent. So the paper in biological conservation, I haven't got an additional resource beyond that. And I'd be welcome to share the paper, but maybe that's something worth thinking about, a website or whatever. But we are writing a few of the things as well to share on this impact. But I think, again, there's lots of scope to be doing a lot more science here.
Right. I did see a quick question flash up on chat from I think it was a small farmer growing with an area of land in the North Downs and asking how he should approach a subject like this.
Well, again, there's very clear evidence for farmland birds that providing food in winter is an absolute necessity now. I mean, it's sad that we have to feed farmland birds in winter, but that's where we are. So if you are feeding birds, or even better, sowing sort of bird food cover crops, for instance, those are absolutely key. I mean, the things where you're providing there are species which are declining and doing very, very badly. You know, with also huge declines of species like corn buntings and linnets and yellowhammers, and these species need our help, whereas common woodland birds don't need our help. Rare woodland birds need our help, and they're not benefiting from the help which, you know, we're sort of giving to woodland birds, which is going to the common stuff. So it is really nuanced there. I mean, the species which are most clearly benefiting of conservation concern are things like house sparrows and starlings in built-up areas, both UK red listed species. For any I know there are a few Brazilians and other people. I know it seems incredible that we care about house sparrows and starlings in this country or anyone in America, but yeah, we can't even look after the commensal species in this country, which are now declining. And then our farmland species also doing very badly, as they are also in North America and in Europe as well. And providing resources for them is great, though I'd much rather we can get to a standpoint where we don't have to provide resources. We can provide ecosystems which they can do well in, whether that's through rewilding or that's through nature-friendly farming. You know, that would be a much better place to be. But we should certainly, you know, the hungry the gap is very, very real for farmland birds, and providing food to get them through that is very important. And that's arisen because we pulled the plug from under them with the end of winter stubbles, basically, and because of the general erosion of farmland biodiversity, because of, you know, nutrient inputs and soil exhaustion and everything else that's happened.
I saw a question flash up a moment ago about, in all of this, what is the effect of overall insect decline, which is obviously been a subject that's been a topic of discussion recently.
Yeah, so the science behind that is a little controversial, but I think there's pretty good evidence that we've lost invertebrate bioabundance in the UK. So you imagine that what inverts are there out there in summer, you know, there's a limited sort of overall budget of insects, and if we've got more of the generalists eating those insects, that's fewer insects for the specialists. So that's competition without which of the feeding, although feeding means more of the specialists. So there certainly are impacts there, although I don't think there's necessarily a huge impact of colossal declines within woodland systems. A lot of those declines are in the farmland systems, where we've lost a lot of our insect bioabundance, and where, you know, we should be, if anything, sort of increasing availability of food for those species. And it's almost like, you know, we talk about generalized versus targeted. Well, targeted for farmland birds, you know, it's not like we want farmers to go up and put peanut feeders up everywhere, but scattering seeds for farmland birds is certainly an important intervention.
I see there are a couple of questions about Brazil.
Yeah,
and
so someone said bird feeders in Brazil cause similar negative impacts. Similar impacts. Well, quite possibly. Again, I guess it depends on that landscape context, and it depends, you know, how many people are feeding birds. So I fed birds in Brazil on my balcony in Belém. I had a hummingbird feeder with 2 species of hummingbirds and banana quits and 2 species of thraupis, or I guess they moved to tangara now, depending on your alpha taxonomy. But, you know, a few tanagers basically. In that system, you know, probably no great harm. If lots and lots and lots of people were feeding birds along the edge of habitat boundaries with, you know, in the Serra do Mar or somewhere, well, you could potentially, there is a scope for an impact and for competition impacts of these generalist and dominant species of tanagers on rarer species. But no one's done the science of that, so, you know, we don't know. But it's always dependent on you know, how many feeders and how much wildland there is, and that's why UK is so special or so weird like that, because, you know, there's feeders everywhere, whereas even in eastern North America, there's still vast areas of forest where no one's really feeding the birds.
There was the question that came up just now about has anything been done on how the high density feeding at the feeders affects stress levels in birds?
I don't know if there's any impact on that as well. there could be stress response. I guess they could go either ways. If you might be less stressed because you've always got food, you might be in competition, maybe because you're spending more time close to people or close to predators, you might end up getting more stressed. But I don't think anyone's done that, and it would be a really interesting research question. There's been quite a lot done on stress on urban birds in general, but I don't think anyone's ever sort of linked that to bird feeding, basically. There's some other researchers at MMU that do a lot on like noise pollution on stress levels in urban birds, and found that like just like we get really annoyed by loud noises, well, birds do as well, almost like go mad from especially birds near airports. We know that from like playback trials where the birds will literally like go crazy and jumping up and down the speaker and everything else, and they can almost go deaf, for instance. So there's certainly a lot of stress impacts on birds from anthropogenic causes, and yeah, the bird feeding will be interesting from that. But I don't, it could go either way from thinking about it.
No, absolutely brilliant. I think I'll probably step back at this point, but your talk has more than fulfilled certainly my hopes and amply illustrated the fact that there's no such thing as a free lunch in ecology. Whatever you do always has unexpected impacts. And I find it fascinating as a long-term skeptic of generalized bird feeding to realize now the scope of the consequences. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Robert, and for the invitation.
No, brilliant.
And thank you, Alex, very much indeed. It's been a terrific talk and a lot to think about, and the questions as well that have been flooding in whilst you've been talking. I don't know whether we can add those to what we put out when we put out your talk. And I know a number of people have found it difficult to log in. So I'm going to let them know that what the link is to the YouTube link when we put it up. So once again, thank you very much indeed. I hope everybody's enjoyed as much as we have, and that you may be joining us on the 15th of November to hear more about the lives of our woodpeckers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Good evening.
Take care.